Hello and welcome to That Nerd Thing, where we uncover the magical impact that fandoms have on our lives. I'm Morgan, and today I have a guest that is, I think this might be, no, it's not the first time, but I have a guest that is a therapist that I don't know personally that reached out because I've had a few therapists on the show so far as friends of mine. But what I was so excited about is that you reached out because you're like, I want to be on a show where I could talk about this nerdy stuff outside of the therapy world. And I'm like, yeah, that's why I started this show. So today I have author and therapist Ben Stimpson, and he is an expert in like folklore and magic and spiritualism. So cool. So welcome, Ben, to the show. I'm so excited to have you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Yes, as a therapist, like with my own network up here in Ontario, it's rare that I don't know therapists in Ontario. So when I meet somebody who I don't know, it's always like, wait, who? But it's always 3 degrees of separation in the therapy world.
Yeah. So do you want to tell listeners just a little bit of your background and kind of the work you've done? So this episode's probably going to come out sometime in October, which I feel like is so fitting and like Halloween season. Yeah.
Of course. Well, so I am a therapist, but I'm also an author. Majority of my written work is mostly in the pagan and kind of witchcraft spiritual spaces, which also intersects with fandom. So a lot of my work in therapy is narrative based. I often use fandom and I use narrative therapy in my written work, and it also intersects then with like ritual work in my magical work. So Joseph Campbell's monomyth is a big frame that I've had and used in the past with ritual, and that of course leads into things like LARPing, role-playing, tabletop gaming, and the relationship between individuals and their characters. And I'm also a gamer myself. Gaming is a really big part of my life as well, or at least was a big part of my life before I became an author. Now it's like editing and doing all that shit. Yeah, so that's me.
Cool. It's so fascinating how you have so many different parts of your identity and you find ways to sort of put them all together.
It's interesting. It's really like, so I know this isn't a therapy-based show, but I have to because it's integrative. I did all my training in Ontario, and I did spiritual psychotherapy, which is really transpersonal and Jungian and all that cool stuff, tarot cards and archetypes and things. In the UK, they have a term integrative, which is when somebody is bringing in little bits of here, little bits of there, and integrating different modalities. And I feel like my whole life is that, very integrative in that way. So when I found a few years ago when I retrained, because I originally was in social work, or I trained in social work, I didn't go into it. I found that, the ability to be both a writer in the pagan spaces, also a gamer and a nerd and all the fandoms, and also bring in the therapy work and bring them all together. That's my particular niche. I tend to work mostly with clients from all of those different areas. And because I'm queer, there's a big intersection there with the queer community. And it's also a stereotype of like, the bear who is also a gamer, who is a septum piercing, who is also like grown up on Buffy the Vampire Slayer and now does witchcraft as it's like a weird, and is also polycule, right? So it's an interesting kind of intersection.
Cool. You ready to jump into your nerdy identity?
Let's do it.
What is the first thing that you were nerdy about?
I think the very first thing I was nerdy about was fantasy, particularly the trade paperbacks back in the 90s. So like things like Dragonlance and Wizards of the Coast. I never got into gaming, but I was really into the fantasy novels that came out of that. And then of course like that led into television shows and eventually into gaming. So video games were a big thing for me back in the 90s. And that was my real nerdy thing.
Cool. So fantasy and video games.
Fantasy and video games, yeah.
Yeah. What do you love about fantasy?
I think back then, it's kind of shifted over the years, I'll be honest. So I just turned 38 last week, and I've over the past 20 years, it's shifted away from kind of slash and sorcery type fantasy into more urban fantasy. I really love urban magic and the idea of like you can turn around a corner in a dark alley and come across some ancient God, it's a really cool kind of thing, and I feel like the whole industry has moved that way. But what I love about fantasy is it allows us to project into a safe space. It allows us to extend ourselves completely out of the norm And for me, back when I was a really young teenager, after I'd moved to Canada, I'm originally from the United Kingdom. After I'd moved to Canada and I was bullied a lot, fantasy was a space that I could go into and just be completely separated from the Hickville that I was living in, right? And it connected me to all the things I was used to, because growing up in the UK, there's ancient castles everywhere. There's ancient structures everywhere. It doesn't matter what part of the area that you're in. There's always something that is 2,000 years old or 3,000 years old, right? So I think that really connected me in. And now, living in North America and not having that sort of landscape, bringing the magic into the now has been a big thing. So that's what I love about fantasy, is it's both that ability to escape, but also ability to bring into the now,
Beautiful answer.
I hope that makes sense.
It does. I'm listening. I'm like, wow, this is so succinct. I'm like, this would be a good social media clip. No, that's super. It's true. And it's so interesting to think about people who grow up with all these castles near them, and then people who don't, and they envision one day being able to see a castle. Very, very interesting.
It's a weird thing. I had the opportunity about 10, 15 years ago of going back to the UK after about 15 years, and I was working at a satellite campus for a Canadian university, and they use this castle over there as a satellite campus. So they send students on 6 or 8 week journeys where they go and they do a college course or 2 college courses, and that's entirely all they do, and they go on all these field trips and things like that. And it was a weird sort of thing, because I'm used to that because I grew up with it. It's like when you're used to something, it doesn't have the mystique. It's just normal. But to see it through all of these, Canadians who had never, or a lot of Americans went, and it was like, wow, this is Harry Potter, or wow, this is like the worst witch. It was an interesting sort of thing, because, I was able to enjoy it through their eyes, coming into that space, like walking up a staircase that Queen Elizabeth I 500 years ago had walked up, right? It's like, what is this? It's interesting.
I love that.
Yeah.
What is your favorite nerdy thing?
When I reached out to you, I was really excited to talk about the Elder Scrolls. So that's my absolute favorite fandom. I have way too many favorite fandoms, but that I think is the most important to me. And it was, for me, a really cool thing being up in the middle of the country here. The games I was able to just immerse myself in a way that so many other games you don't have the option to, because they're not designed that way. So I think most people know the Elder Scrolls by now, Skyrim and Morrowind and Oblivion. Those who don't know, they are a fandom that goes back almost 25 years now. They're a franchise that goes back almost 25 years.
Wow.
Yeah, they go to the late 90s. People don't realize it. They started out as very typical, slash and sorcery type games. They were, the first game was the Elder Scrolls Oblivion, Morrowind, I should say, was the third game. And that was when the company was taken over by a different company. So beforehand, kind of like how Fallout was, they were owned by a different company beforehand. And then they just expanded it. And it's just a totally immersive map. It is not directed in any way. There is story plot within it that you can follow, but you can just wander about and just explore. And the music is award-winning. Jeremy Soule, who I know that there is some issues with nowadays. Some stuff came out about him, unfortunately, but it doesn't take away from the enjoyment of the music. It's just expansive, and so you're wandering around. Skyrim was my particular favorite because it was my first major game of getting into it, and then I played the other ones. And you'll just be wandering about, and you'll start walking up a hill, and then suddenly snow will start falling, and the music will just change, and there's such an ambience, and it was such an immersive experience that it was an experience playing that for the first time. It's become my favorite, so much so that I've got various tattoos of them, of the symbols all over my body. So that's kind of a part.
Oh, that's so cool. Having done a lot of these interviews, it seems like sometimes what really makes these fandoms or whatever it is really special is that ability to immerse ourselves in it. And you're right. I'm sure the visuals, the music, the other sounds, the story, it all makes it really meaningful.
Very meaningful in ways that I think are so multidimensional that we can't even really pin it on one thing. For me, there's the fourth wall is such an important part of my magic, for example. This is why I love the magic of the theater, the magic of group ritual, the magic of story. There's a difference between fiction and folklore in that folklore can happen at any moment around us. The fourth wall doesn't exist in legend the same way it does with fiction. When you pick up a book and you're reading a book, yeah, you can get immersed in it, but you close the book and then you're not in that book anymore. Versus folklore or like urban legends. I was writing an article on urban legends before. Urban legends are so powerful to us because they happen to a friend of ours. They could have, they could be at any diner, in any movie theater, at any mall, in any like lonely old road that any of us know. And so they are very familiar. And so I think with these games, they become familiar to us that we can fully immerse ourselves in. And fandoms in general, I think, become that. There are so many subcultures that have developed because of fandoms that they become more than just a book that we pick up and read. They become cultures that we become part of. And I think that's a really big piece of it,
What is the Elder Scrolls fandom like?
I think it's a very different, it's interesting. It's a very different fandom because there are so many people involved with it, because it's gone for such a long time. You get people who, they really love the cosplay of it, so they'll cosplay the characters. Then you'll get people who are really interested in the actual lore itself. So you get the lore kind of masters who are really interested in the stories that are shown. And the cool thing with the Elder Scrolls is they don't put the story right out to you. You have to go in the game to pick up a book in the game and read the story in a book. So it's like you learn about the world as you're immersed in it. So you get those people who, like, there's some really cool YouTube, Shoddycast, for example, was a well-known, they've now no longer are producing, but they were a very well-known lore website that you could go on, and they had these beautifully stunning videos of the lore inside made with Machina. And it was, again, that immersive experience. You learned about it as you were watching these videos. You could see the scenes. So the fandom is very different. Like, there's various different aspects of the fandom there. There's also those, the fanboys who, they're on the Elder Scrolls Morg, and so they're, interacting with each other, whereas the other games are entirely single player, so the experience is entirely yours. So you get those segments too.
Cool.
Yeah.
What are you currently nerdy about?
I'm currently nerdy about urban folklore. So I'm actually writing or starting to write a book on urban folklore and looking at the kind of the evolution of those stories and the nostalgia of those stories. So I'm really interested in popular nostalgia and aesthetic, and this is partly because of recent TV shows like The Sandman, for example, the episode of the 24-Hour Diner, that sense of that nostalgia from the late 90s and early 2000s, which I feel like a lot of younger people are starting to explore and take on, mainly because of Netflix, right? We're seeing a lot of these stories being set in places like drive-in movie theaters that really don't exist anymore, but there's that whole mystique about those. So I'm really interested in those stories and how those characters are starting to come into like creepypasta, for example, how some of those like internet memes are becoming urban legends, and how those urban legends are really forms of like older folklore from like 100, 200, 300 years ago. So I'm really interested in that right now. So more from an academic standpoint, but also just to like learn. I went and ordered a load of one folklorist's books. He has like 18 books out, and he's like the preeminent folklorist when it comes to urban legends. And like some of his titles are Too Good to Be True, The Colossal Book of Urban Legends, or The Vanishing Hitchhiker, Urban Legends of the 21st Century. And it's just, I don't know, it's just something about it that's just so familiar, but again, also so different as well. I love it.
So fascinating. I don't even know if this has anything to do with what you're saying, but as you're speaking, I'm thinking about like the concept in either movies or TV shows of like this idea of a space where people go that's kind of like an in-between.
The liminal
Kind of,
spaces.
yeah. Super cool. I don't know why that just came to mind with sharing all of this.
I mean, this is the thing. It's true. These spaces are liminal. They are encounter points. The liminal spaces, that's really where magic is, as both a spiritual practitioner, but also as a folklorist. And even just like a human being, like the stories we tell, they can be the most ridiculously untrue stories, and yet they're in here, right? And I think that's part of the mystique. When people went to some of the kids I was with in England, they were so excited about meeting a local who would tell them local legends in the pub. Like, there's something about the pub and meeting an old guy in the pub who's going to tell them stories. I see you're smiling, right? You know what I mean, right?
Yeah.
Or like going to like a tavern on the open road if you're going on a road trip and meeting a local who in a thick like southern accent is going to tell you about, the local gossip. It's just something about it that just is so,
So interesting. What do you think is the most underrated, either nerdy thing about you or just in general?
Underrated. I have, a lot of collectibles. I have a lot, like, I don't cosplay. I used to LARP, live action role play, back in the day, about 10 years ago. And I don't have the stamina to do camping like that anymore. Not anymore. I think the underrated piece is how important this is and how it connects to other parts of life, right?
That's one of the things that I love so much just about being nerdy and fandom is it's not just an escape. It means
No.
so much more to us to help us experience life and form relationships and feel our emotions and understand ourselves. It's so much more than escape.
It's language, right? It's the frames of reference for people to relate to each other and communicate through, and to explore ourselves and others through, right? This is, coming from the therapy world, I know this isn't a therapy conversation, but
That's okay. It's part of who we are.
We, for such a long time, there was such a bias against fandoms as just escape, right?
Right.
And so
right.
people who were chronic gamers, a lot of times therapists and social workers and psychologists would just label that as escapism and say, well, you're just, you're not looking at your problems in life, instead of looking at how are people relating to, again, themselves, to others, to their situations. You can tell a lot about how people are living their life through the virtual spaces. And I think what really, the lynch point is when we started to live a lot more of our lives in virtual spaces, right? About 10, 15 years ago, we look at Gamergate, for example, that whole bullshit. But it did prove to us how much, right, of our lives are online now. You've got these core people who maybe back in the 90s, they were, ostracized and gaming was their place of refuge. But then as it expanded, so many more people were able to enjoy it and find themselves and find their niche and explore themselves through it. And so gaming and fandom means so many different things to different people now. And that's a wonderful aspect of fandom, because it's become popular. And because it's become popular, it's expanded to include, and it's become inclusive. And I love that. I think that's a really important thing. And in the psychology world, I think there's a real shift now to understanding that. There was a wonderful book by Dr. Alexander Chris called The Gaming Mind, and he's a gamer himself. He's I think he's early 40s now, but he talked about how when you work with a client who's gaming and who has designed their own character, this is true for fandom, this is true for any kind of persona connected to a fandom, LARPing character, any of those. You get to be able to talk to that character, to that person, with the language that they're using, and you can explore yourself. But that's a perennial thing. You go back 50 or 60 or 70 years and you talk to people in the same way. Talk to me about your favorite literary character. You go back 200 years. Talk to me about your favorite biblical character. We are always finding characters that we are connecting with, and through that connection, projecting onto. We can learn about ourselves through that character. We all have superheroes. We all have comic book heroes that we really love and we connect with. And these fandom characters are exactly the same thing.
I feel like everything you just said is exactly why I created this podcast. It's so true, though. Like, these characters mean something to us. People work through their own stuff.
Absolutely.
Through stories.
Absolutely. And I think, what's really interesting then is, and I do this a lot with my own therapy clients and myself, is when you talk to them or when you ask them about what their favorite characters were or their favorite fandoms were when they were younger to now, how has that shifted? I often find that people begin to associate more with the villain than with the character, because in the villain, they're starting to understand, okay, life isn't as simple as it was back when I was younger. Things are a lot more complicated. I can empathize with Maleficent. I can empathize with Ursula. I can empathize, especially in the queer community, any marginalized populations. We often see this too, right?
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So for you, how has your fandom sort of changed over time?
So when I first came to Canada, it was 1995, and I was this little British kid. My blonde hair had turned dark by then. I was actually a little blonde kid. I think you can actually see somewhere. Oh no, never mind. I was going to say there's a picture on me on the back console there, but little blonde kid, all my hair gone, and I was dark haired, and I had big rimmed glasses. And of course, 1999, Harry Potter came. So what did a lot of bullies do? They bullied me because I was Harry Potter.
Wow, that's awful.
So Harry Potter and I have had a journey over the years, which is interesting. I mean, which is a little devastating because of some of the politics around J.K. Rowling and all of that. But I still have a soft spot for Harry. Over those years, I can see how, that little kid with the being outside of his community, I've really come back into my community. I found the magical world again. I've become part of this world that I was striving for so long. So I really appreciate Harry Potter in that way. But I've kind of grown out of Harry Potter. I'm now, I would say, more like Giles from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So it's interesting, kind of as I age, who I now associate with and who I aspire to be in that way. All of those characters from the 90s and the 2000s, there seems to always be one now that I can look at and be like, oh yeah, that's me. I didn't see myself that way before, but now I'm totally Giles now, right? Do you find the same with you?
I definitely think that there's different fandoms and characters that at some point in time I kind of like shift with who I love reading about or who I understand more or who I identify with. I'm trying to think like right now if there's anything I'm particularly into. I feel like right now all my nerdy energy is going into podcasting. But one show that I keep thinking of, and it's probably just the topic of this episode so far, is Supernatural.
Oh, Supernatural, yes.
Yeah, I love the journey of the family journey and the brothers and the emotional growth. I like seeing character arcs over time. I think that's something I really enjoy the most.
It gives you that sense of belonging, perhaps?
I enjoy really seeing the complexity of characters and the flaws.
That makes sense. I feel like every generation has the one defining show. Every 5 years or every 10 years, there's that one defining show. And for me, that defining show, like in the 2000s, it was Avatar: The Last Airbender. And then in the 2010s, it was Steven Universe. And I don't know quite which one. I think Hilda might be the one for right now. I'm not sure. We'll see. But there's always that one show that shows that complexity, I think, at least for me. And it sounds like for you, Supernatural was that show.
One of them, yeah. I mean, Doctor Who is probably top show. David Tennant is a dream guest. I say it like every few episodes. I'm like, I really want him on the show. Who knows? I don't think it'll ever happen, but maybe one day. What is the most random nerdy thing about you?
World building. So I went through a period where world building was such an important kind of outlet for me. And this was like mid 2000s. I just got my own computer, so I didn't have to share a computer. And some of your younger listeners might not understand that we went through a period where there was only one computer in the house at one point. But I remember I used to spend hours and hours and hours just drawing maps and like creating little scenes and world building, lore building. I think that's what I really love, because I'm such a history buff. I actually just went back and I completed a bachelor's that I had left unfinished from years and years and years ago. And I went back and studied medieval and classical and religious studies history. And I just love, his history is such a huge part of kind of how I frame the world and see the world, and I just love it. So I used to spend a great deal of time writing histories for these worlds that I was building and like drawing little really intricate maps and things like that. Of course, like no books ever came out of them, but it was that journey of like figuring out and learning, okay, and these people who live in this little area over here, what's their relationship to these people over here, and I put my markers out and I just get into it. And I think that's really continued even now. Yeah, world building. Yeah, it was fun.
That's so fascinating. But
Mhm.
that's a good point because I also find, especially with reading, I
Mhm.
love when a world is being built. I enjoy the most. Maybe not, I like fantasy, but I think the science fiction and
Mhm.
reading the world building of like different technology and all of that, I think it's really neat.
I used to buy those the Star Trek technical manuals and things like that, and the chronologies. I know Star Wars also has them, like the technical guides where you can look through and like look at like the starships and the planets and the things like that. And they have like historical details, and they have there's so many things that just coming out of one writer's mind. Sometimes it's like wow, just avenues to explore, right? So, what's your favorite sci-fi right now,
Right
apart from
now,
Doctor Who?
I love Severance on Apple TV. I
Mm,
really loved it. I'm currently watching Dark Matter, and I know it's based off of a book.
yes.
The show is so good. So I have a couple episodes left. But, and, now I'm thinking about it. I like when there's time travel or
Mhm.
like different dimensions, things like that. I think
Mm.
that's super cool.
Yeah, it creates opportunities. Time travel is a really, really cool trope because
Hmm.
you can go and do time travel and then just delete something and be like, oh, the whole universe is completely changed. And Doctor Who has done that quite often, hasn't it? Where it's just been like just a switch, and then suddenly
Yeah.
the Gallifrey, the Time Lords are back, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So I know you've reached out because you said, you love Elder Scrolls. What type of person do you think would really love playing all those games?
This is the cool thing with the Elder Scrolls. I think it was perfect for the time, and even now, like they're still developing Elder Scrolls 5. But I
Mm.
think it was perfect for time because just like Dungeons and Dragons back in the 80s, anybody can find themselves in these games. So the people who really like directive stories where the story is almost cinematic in a way, you're just being led along a trail, and I don't think they will like the Elder Scrolls because Skyrim and Morrowind and Oblivion are so asynchronous. Like stuff can be happening in one part of a game, and if you walk to another part of a game, it just isn't interacting. With Elder Scrolls, that's actually different. The game is designed to be continually creating itself based on your actions, which is really cool. But like
Ooh.
you can drop things and go to another part of the game and pick up another storyline and then come back to another storyline, and it's still going to be the same. But depending on what you do, options will be kind of limited or changed depending, right? But you can have so many different classes in the games. If you love, being a wizard and using magic, you can go down that route and really put skill sets into magic, in which case then, you're not having to slash and use a bow and arrow. If you want to be a thief, you can put skill sets into that and become strong in that. And there's a whole element of game around the Thieves Guild. And so each time you can build a character in the 200, my longest character was about 500 hours. Hours and hours and
Wow.
hours of putting into these skills. I think that really allows anybody to enter these games and
Mm.
find themselves in it. You can, create the look, you can create the feel, you can actually marry characters in the game, which is really cool. And they added an option where you can have same-sex partners as well. So I think this is why a lot of queer people tend to love it, because it's like they
Yeah.
can just create a whole online world on there.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's really cool. It's really good. If you like immersive experiences, if you need just a few hours of just being in a different world, literally, you can just put your headphones on, play the game, and then just wander around. The whole world map itself is massive. To go from one side of the map to another, and I've counted, I spent an hour doing this, it takes 45 minutes.
Wow.
Which is huge. And that entire span is filled with towns, settlements, mines, and outlaw camps and things like that. So it really is something that you can just do. You can just wander around and collect plants. If you're a herbalist, if you want to do, herbalism, you want to learn that herbalism part, you can just wander around the environment and just collect plants and then learn how to use them to make concoctions and then go and sell those concoctions. So a lot of people who are like live action role playing, who like that immersive experience, often like these types of games. And there's more now. I mean, the Elder Scrolls really set the stage for what
Yeah.
immersive experiences should be. Yeah.
It's like a choose your own adventure.
And the sheer number of quests that are not connected to the main quest is really big. There are quite a few of them where you won't ever encounter them until you encounter them. There's one particular one that I love. The developer must have been drunk when they were creating this, because it's just insane. You're wandering through the forest, and it's like kind of an area that you wouldn't normally go to unless you were in that area. And suddenly this hag raven, this half hag, half raven creature steps out, and just before you attack her, she said, "No, stop! I need your help." And she gives you a quest to go and punish her sister who has stolen one of her magical artifacts. And then there's this whole like love triangle. They were both in love with this hunter, and the hunter was like spurning one of them. And so this is why she wants you to get, it's ridiculous. It's so ridiculous. But it's so fun too, because it's like, you do it all. It takes like an hour. And then you get back to her and she says, "Thank you so much. Here is 10 gold." And it's like, really, 10 gold? It's good.
Love that. What does being a nerd mean to you?
I think being a nerd to me is being interested in the humanity around us. I think that is really a big piece of it. I've learned so much more about myself and what makes others tick through being a nerd. I think that stepping out of mundane reality has allowed me to question a lot of the things that are just taken for granted. I think that being a nerd is about being anti-oppressive and I would definitely say, being kind of against the grain and really questioning those centers of control and those power structures. I think that being a nerd is, as an identity, a signal that I can be who I define and who I want to be, irrespective of anybody else's judgment, right? In spite of, in defiance of other people's judgment. I think that being a nerd is also, it's about community, because we can signal I'm a nerd too, and that means something. That means something. When somebody says I'm a nerd or I'm a geek, that means something. I think that it's as much a flag of community as it is a plea to, I have certain boundaries, I have certain needs, I have certain wants. You're a nerd, okay, you'll probably share those.
I love that. I love that piece about humanity, because that's very true.
Yeah.
In terms of geeky recommendations to help people embrace their nerdiness, I think you said something that is a very unique but such an important thing to do, which is I would recommend when you approach your next nerdy thing, whatever it is, even if you've done it a million times, pretend like it's the first time you're doing it and see what would somebody who's doing this nerdy thing for the first time, what would it be like for them? And I think it could bring a new magic to what you're experiencing.
I think to add to that, I would say enter every fandom like it is your new, like the first time or the first fandom. I think that oftentimes people will have expectations of what a show or a game or a like cosplay or whatever it is, whatever the nerdiness is based on. They'll assume that it's like all the others, and they're setting themselves up for some letdown because of that. I can't think of the word. There was a better word for that, but I think it's a letdown, right? So I think going into any of these experiences, any of these universes with an open eye. Some universes are going to be badly written, but they're okay because they're just really cute. Some universes are going to be so elaborate and wonderful and all of this, and will take over your life because of it, right? Finding yourself instead of trying to get that thing to conform to what your expectations are, because it's not like Skyrim. I've certainly done that. I've picked up a game thinking it'll just be like Skyrim, and it hasn't been like that. And I've actually not appreciated it because of that. But when I've come back to it later on, I'm like, no, this is really good as it is,
Yeah, that's great. Do you have any other recommendations you wanted to share?
Like, look at the recommendations of what people are, thinking about. There are so many companies now producing fandoms and nerdy things that it's very easy to become overwhelmed. There's a lot of copycats, of course, too, right? I would also say look in your local areas. I think that society swung back now to people wanting to connect about their fandoms and connect about their nerdiness again. Go to your local gaming cafe and just sit and explore, right? I think that for at least 10 years there, people were so focused on virtual spaces that they weren't really looking at their local shops anymore. I think that's really changed. I think, our local gaming shops and our local kind of hobby shops are starting to thrive again because people are wanting that tactile experience. Go and explore, because we're very friendly people and we want to share our stuff. So go in and you'll be making friends left, right, and center.
Love that. Well, Ben, thank you so much for being here. I hope it was refreshing to talk about this stuff on a nerd podcast rather than, a therapy or mental health podcast. I think you had a lot of really fascinating things to share. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. This has been lovely. Thank you.
So where can people find you?
So everything is on benstimpson.com. That has all of the stuff about my books, my podcast. Those who are into like magic-based fandoms and are practitioners themselves. I have a podcast where I interview a lot of the authors in the pagan and magical spheres, and we talk about psychic stuff. We talk about magic. We often talk about fandoms too, because those are really connected in. That's all on there. Also information about my classes that I have, all sorts of stuff. So benstimpson.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I'll share the link to that in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening. Please be sure that you are following That Nerd Thing in your favorite podcast app so that you never miss an episode. And if you are able to leave a 5-star review wherever you are listening, that would help me so much because, those numbers really do matter with the algorithm. You can email me at thatnerdthingpod@gmail.com, and you can follow the show on social media at thatnerdthingpod. And I'll see you next time. Bye.